thank you everyone for coming. It's nice to see so many people from the area attending and expressing their interest in this. This again is a Repower REC house party, kind of around broadband. And just so to make sure everybody's familiar, Repower REC is a group that is not affiliated directly with Rappahannock Electric Cooperative. It is a group that was started by member owners of the electric cooperative who are working to help bring reform and some much needed change to the cooperative. So just a little bit of background on why we're all here and how this group came together. And so tonight we are pleasured to welcome two wonderful guest speakers. First up, we've got Christopher Mitchell, who is the Director of Community Broadband Networks Initiative at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And he is a leading expert nationally on community broadband networks and is a major force behind not only bringing broadband to folks and knowing the technology behind that, but about public ownership and community ownership of these systems. So he's a huge supporter and proponent of that. And he also runs muninetworks.org, which is an online resource of information about community broadband, which has been tracking the involvement of rural electric cooperatives in broadband nationally. So he knows a whole lot about what's going on in the rural electric cooperative world and how that pertains to broadband. So we are super pleased and honored that he was able to join us. And we also have Seth Heald with us, who is a co-founder of Repower REC. And he is also a huge supporter of rural electric cooperatives being providers of broadband and of broadband coming to our rural communities as a whole. And he is a board candidate in this year's election. He is running in the one contested race that we have in our local election this year. So we'll be able to hear a bit from him as well. Without any further ado, thank you, Christopher, for joining us tonight. And I will pass it over to you. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. We work with a variety of electric cooperatives around the country. We've tracked what they're doing, also telephone cooperatives. And I think there's no better sign of a cooperative, it's hope for the future than seeing groups of people getting together to talk about how to make it better. You know, I worry more when I see nobody talking about their cooperative. So I'm excited to be a part of this group to give a presentation today. I think I'm going to share a graphic, but I'm going to talk just a little bit about what we're seeing around the country, a few lessons that we think are related to broadband in the part of Virginia you're in. But the first thing I always like to just say is from the organization called the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Many of you are probably familiar with John Farrell's work on democratic energy. And I actually started just a few months after John. He and I are both around 13, 14 years here with the Institute, but the organization itself is 45 years old. Work on a variety of issues, supporting local Main Street type economies. And my work started about 15 years ago. The program began just before I got here to take it over. And the idea was basically that communities have no control over internet access. Local governments, counties, even states cannot compel providers to offer service. They can't make sure the rates are fair. They can't make sure the networks are reliable. They really can't do much of anything. It's all controlled at the federal level, and the federal level's mostly decided to take a hands-off approach. So our concern was, this is an essential input for the economy. It's essential for quality of life, for education, for healthcare. What do you do if you're a local community? And so we started looking at options, and they generally came down to owning the network because the owners make decisions. And so we looked at municipal ownership models, and we also looked at cooperative models. Now, the cooperative models are mostly premised on the existing telephone and electric cooperatives. It is very difficult to start a brand new broadband cooperative. There's been a few that have done it, but for the most part, the success has come from taking telephone cooperatives and electric cooperatives and steering them in the direction of these very high capacity networks. So I think it's worth just sharing my screen here briefly. I didn't want to do a lot of slides or anything, but I've got one that I can share for people who are able to view it. And that is our map, which is also available on muninetworks.org. If you go there and search around for our rural cooperatives page, um, the first thing you may notice is that there's actually a lot of fiber networks in rural America. More than many people assume. And that's largely because of the telephone cooperatives that are in the brown. They've been doing this for 10 or 15 years. Now, they have a lot more history with this because they were upgrading from copper systems to fiber optic systems that are very high capacity long ago. The electric cooperatives really just started getting involved about 10 years ago. And so you'll notice there's some splotches of that dark purple, and then there's a lot more of the lighter purple. And that's because many of the electric cooperatives that have started doing this, they're serving those people in the dark areas already. And then the lighter areas are where we believe they are going to expand, often because they've said so directly. In some cases, they've taken awards of subsidies that require them to expand to those areas. And in other cases, they've just said, we have a commitment to serve everyone, and it may take 5 years, it may take 8 years, but we're going to get to everyone. So the first thing that you may notice if you look in over here, and I can zoom in here, I think this will let me do that to the Virginia area. We are tracking, last time we updated it, there's at least 5 electric co-ops that are active in making fiber optic investments in Virginia. And one I'll talk about a little bit more, CVEC, Central Virginia, because I spoke with them last year and had a really good story. But first, I wanted to note, I'll just leave this up here for another minute and then I'll take it down. First, I wanted to note that there's a discussion about what's the appropriate level of service and things like that. And I sometimes go over that, but I'm really going to ignore that here. I think if you're tuning in, you're probably agreeing with us that this is the level of service that should be available. The same level of service that's available in urban areas should be available in rural areas. That's been United States policy since 1934, that we should have roughly comparable telecommunications access across the country. And so I don't think it's appropriate to suggest that we should settle for something less than in rural areas. And I think it's important to note that the electric cooperatives have been very responsible in tending to invest in the highest level of technology when they go into it. The other thing I'll say about that is I think we'll all agree that broadband is essential. We weren't arguing really all that much about it before COVID, but after COVID-19, there is no argument that not only is broadband essential, but we need to have it in our homes. It needs to be affordable, it needs to be reliable, and we're gonna have to count on it. So maybe I wanted to focus the majority of my comments on what the electric cooperatives are doing. Now, about, I'd say 5-6 years ago, we had maybe a few cooperatives that were being aggressive around fiber. Now we have well over 100, closing in on 150. Our site, I think, is currently tracking 108, 110, but we have not updated it in recent months. There's been a lot more announcements. I mean, just even, I think there's 13 as of right now, maybe even 15 in the last couple of days in Mississippi that have announced that they're moving forward with plans. Mississippi, I think, had like 1 or 2 a year ago. So it's really growing rapidly in some areas, in part because of federal subsidies. There's a significant opportunity in a federal auction that will begin this fall, and a lot of electric co-ops are making sure they're participating in that, both because having some subsidies will really help to build a network, but also because if they're even thinking about it right now, you don't want some rival to be getting subsidies to go to the best areas. You don't want to miss this opportunity, because then once you decide you're going to try and build to everyone, the business model will be better off if you as an electric co-op get those subsidies than if someone else does. But I wanted to talk about why we're seeing electric cooperatives step up for this. And one of those reasons is this auction. Another is that the electric cooperatives serve the most rural parts of the United States, where we see the least broadband investment. Their members desperately need it. The electric co-ops also see that this is good for demand. And so not only is this a matter of electric cooperatives in many cases are very responsive to member owners' needs and the needs of the community, but also there's an existential threat if you're facing declining power sales, particularly in a time where we want to switch to new generation sources and things like that. So fiber optics and broadband can represent a real strengthening of the business by making sure you have population growth, or at the very least you stabilize population, you can attract businesses in, and that sort of a thing. It's very hard to see population growth or new business investment in areas that do not have high quality broadband. And I'm not talking about DSL cutting it or anything like that. I'm talking about very high quality broadband before businesses are likely to locate in these areas. And I think the main thing that sums all this up is that the electric cooperatives that are doing this, they think of themselves not as narrowly being electric cooperatives, but as being organizations that are focused on bringing essential technology to the community. This is about democratizing essential technology and making sure that these areas are not left behind. And if you go back to the rhetoric we saw when these cooperatives were formed, I think you can read that into a lot of the organizing around it. And if you haven't looked into that, I'm sure many of you would be interested. It's just amazing. I mean, it's fascinating, the stories about how a lot of these cooperatives were founded and the arguments with industry about it. So I want to make a case that this is a smart business proposition, because one of the reasons we see electric cooperatives being nervous is a concern they may not get enough subscribers to make the business case work, and that it could be a drain on the business or threaten the cooperative's finances. And I think this is a very serious concern. I would not recommend electric cooperatives get involved if they cannot come to a good business plan that they have faith in. But I think the thing to look for right now is a business plan that can scrape by today. Because in 5 years, I think we all know that in many of the areas where people might be resistant or not interested, every year that goes by, demand goes up for these high quality networks, whether that's because of new families coming in, replacing people that just weren't interested, or population growth. What we usually see is business cases that can scrape by today. In 5 years, they look good. And in 10 years, they look amazing. And that's because you're offering a service for which there will likely not be significant competition. The electric co-op territories are not going to see new investment from private companies. The satellite services are not going to be so much better. They're not going to be better at all. Frankly, they'll probably be more expensive and have worse customer service. So this is a business model that gets a lot better with time, because you have what they call in Wall Street a moat. People are not going to be trying to overbuild, particularly in your most rural areas. So I want to talk briefly about CVEC, because first of all, I really enjoyed my conversation with them at the Central Virginia Electric, where they were doing Firefly. And I spoke with them a year ago. They were talking about things that were important, like smart grid. I don't know how hard you all got hit by the hurricane. I know that New York is digging out. I live in tornado country myself. So the smart grid is not just about remote metering. It's about resilience, being able to keep your uptime up, which is also really good for attracting businesses, but also things like surveillance at substations, being able to be more secure, to have a sense of what's going on. So that's one of the reasons that they were doing it. They said the same thing. I've talked to probably 15, 20 different electric cooperatives now on my podcast, which is Community Broadband Bits. And every single one of them, CVEC was no different, talked about how just the membership loved it. They were just so excited for it. And there's a story that is not the first time I heard it, but they had a problem customer, a guy who felt that the cooperative had wronged him and owed him $85. And when a crew came to install the fiber, he would not let them on his property, and basically told them to come back with a check or to not come back at all. And so the next day they actually came back to talk to him and said, hey, it's okay. We just needed access to your property to be able to set up this fiber optic service. But if you're not interested in it, then we don't even have to be on your property at all. So we'll leave you alone.
And the guy called the office and said, wait a minute, this is for the internet. I really want the internet. I really want that service. Tell your guys to come out tomorrow. I'll be there with an open gate and coffee for them, because he was so excited. So you take a person who's like ornery and frustrated with the co-op, and they turn them into an ally. And I've just heard that from several different folks, how the membership love it, and it's even helped them with some of the folks they've had some challenges with. So then one thing I want to note as well is that some of the electric cooperatives that we tried to interview to get their stories out are ones in which the management and the board has at first had deep reluctance or concerns about getting involved in broadband. Delta Montrose Electric Association on the western slope of Colorado, they have a large service territory, and communities were planning on building their own networks, in part because the co-op wasn't interested. And the communities went to the co-op board and said, hey, you actually have some long distance fiber that would be really helpful through some of these mountain passes and things like that. It would save us millions and millions of dollars if you lease us some spare capacity. And the co-op manager basically said, nope, we don't want to do anything with broadband. We're not interested at all. No way, no how. And so the folks in the community basically decided to do a big push. They brought 90 businesses to the next co-op board meeting. They changed 2 people on the board. It was a larger board than I'm fairly certain that you have. And they suddenly, the co-op said, you know, we're very enthusiastic about this now, when they saw how much it meant to the members. And so they turned around and they are now building a massive fiber optic network. The other example is in New Hampshire just recently with an electric co-op, where again, the general manager and board were reluctant. They felt that it was something they weren't very familiar with. It seemed foreign to them. And in their bylaws, they are able to have a referendum nonetheless. And they did, but they needed to have 65% or 66% in order for it to pass, 2/3 majority. And they got 64%. So they didn't force through that the electric co-op would get involved with broadband, but the co-op got the message, and they decided that they are investigating it and setting up some pilot projects. And so one of the things we've seen is that cooperatives that even where the strategy to engage the board doesn't necessarily work as expected, the board often does get the message. And so as I'm heading toward wrapping up, as usual, I have much more that I want to say, but I would love to cover it in the Q&A. I see some questions have already come through, but I'm not going to dive into them until after Seth has a chance to talk. One of the things I want to note is that, I think as I end, is that it's not a good idea to wait very long. And that's, sometimes there's an expectation, oh, maybe a private company will come in, there will be new technology that will solve this. There's nothing on the horizon that's going to be nearly as good as the cooperative building a fiber optic network that it stands behind. We certainly could see new wireless investments, and there's significant parts of Virginia that are getting new wireless investments, and I think that's much better than nothing. I also think that people in those areas will pay more than most people are paying for fiber optic services from their electric cooperatives, and they'll get a lot less, both in terms of reliability and speed. I don't think that's going to be a good long-term solution. One of the other solutions that we're seeing is satellite. And a lot of talk about low Earth orbit satellites. And you should expect, you're going to see really great stories about low Earth orbit satellites over the next few months to 6 months. I would say 2 months to 6 months. And that's because they're doing beta testing. And rather than having 1,000 or 1,500 people on a satellite, they're having 5 who are beta testing it. And so we don't really know what the actual performance is going to be like. We don't know the pricing. But in the meantime, tech sites are going to talk about how this is amazing because they can get very high quality service through low Earth orbit satellites. There's a lot of questions, but the number one is that I don't think everyone in your service territory will be able to subscribe. There will probably be waiting lists because they are limited by the number of people they can serve geographically. And so if anything, low Earth orbit satellites, it'll be good if you want to trade stocks. I have no doubt that that will be a good solution for you if you can, if you're willing to pay, $100 a month potentially, maybe just $80 a month, and get at the front of the list right away. But not everyone will be able to sign up until there's only a certain number of people that can sign up per square mile effectively, and that will be, it's more like a per 50 square miles. And so it's not going to be the big solution for everyone. And I would encourage you to just keep that in mind as you see a lot of the fawning over it in the near future. The co-op will want to connect everyone, as the history of co-ops is that you don't leave members behind. And that's not going to be the case for satellite. I'm afraid satellite's actually going to make things harder to just make the business cases work, rather than helping. And so with that, the last thing I did want to say was that we need cooperatives to engage in last mile solutions where they're actually building the networks to the homes. Middle mile solutions where you're just building along major arterials or things like that and then leasing to others. That will most likely lead to people who have the better economic case being connected. And then when you want to connect the people who have less money or the people who live farther away, the business case is going to be so much harder. I just worry deeply about these middle mile solutions where you build some fiber along arterials. It just tends to encourage cherry picking rather than the kinds of solutions we want to see. And so I think it's important to keep those long-term effects in mind. And so with that, I'm looking forward to Q&A at the end of the session. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christopher. That was excellent, very informative, and I think answered a lot of questions already that folks have. And so now I'll pass it over to Seth Heald, who is our local candidate for the REC board, and I'll pass it over to you, Seth.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Chris, for that introduction. I learned a lot, and I'm so glad that we were able to bring you here and have such a good turnout for this event. I've been a member of REC for 12 years or so, and I've been attending the annual meetings for just about the last 10 years. I might have missed one here or there. And I've noticed in the last 3 or 4 years how more and more of the people who come have questions about broadband. And I myself live in an area where my broadband is from satellite, or my internet is from satellite. It's not really broadband. And it's been a problem. Every year, the questions at the annual meeting seem a little more urgent. And every year, in the last few years, what we heard from the CEO was, we're going to build this fiber optic network for our own internal electric utility purposes. And then other businesses can come in and they can rent some of our capacity and they can install that last mile. But it hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened year after year. Meanwhile, I follow through the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association website and their Twitter account and Facebook account. I can see all around the country and all around Virginia, other co-ops are doing that last mile. Some of them have already got it installed, as Chris showed on the map. Others have it under construction. It's happening more and more. And just in the last week, I've seen several announcements. And I think it's a shame that our co-op has been behind the 8 ball on this. There's some promising signs that REC is beginning to get the message. Even though last year, the CEO, Kent Farmer, said, we're just not going to do that last mile. The co-op has, in the last couple of months, written to some counties saying, you know, would you consider joining with us and doing the last mile? The REC sent some employees recently to speak at the Louisa County Board of Supervisors. You can watch that 1-hour session, a video of it online. It's very interesting for people who haven't seen it. And you can see that the co-op is beginning to think about shifting its position. Although the employees noted, ultimately it's up for the board to make a decision whether we're going to do this. And just, I think maybe in the last week or so, at least didn't come to my attention until last week, excuse me, REC put a new broadband position statement on the co-op's website. And I'll put a link to that in the chat. Great timing to get something in my throat. And it's REC is considering, it says, setting up a fiber to the home subsidiary, but they haven't committed to it yet. So this is a crucial time. And broadband isn't the only issue I've been working on. I've been very concerned about governance issues at REC, at some of the policies on clean energy. And I think at a board of directors that tends to be unengaged, disengaged, not really connected to the membership of the co-op. And the management has inserted itself and insulated the board from member concerns. And I don't think that's the way a co-op should operate. And so my campaign for board, I put my email address out when I announced my candidacy. I've had a number of exchanges on the phone and email with members who were thinking of voting for me or not thinking of voting for me. That's the way a democratic co-op should operate. And of course, we should mention the COVID pandemic, which has made this all way more crucial than it already was. So the time is now to do it. My candidate information is on the repowerrec.com website. I have some information about broadband there. I provide links to other co-ops that are already doing this or have done it. And the main way to get your co-op to do something and to move them off the dime is to vote in board elections. Only 5% of REC members vote in the elections. We need to change that. I've heard a lot of people, some people have started petition drives here and there, which is fine. And we have our own petition on repowerrec.com that includes broadband. And I hope everybody on this call who hasn't already gone there will go there and sign our petition. But ultimately, people need to vote in the election. Only 5% of the members vote. Some of the elections can be quite close. So literally every single vote matters. I know I've recognized some names on the list tonight who are attending who I know have voted, but if you haven't voted, I urge you, there's only one contested election, that's me versus an incumbent. I urge you to go to my website to learn about the issues, go to the REC website. There are videos from all the candidates. And the deadline to vote is coming up soon. It's basically almost too late now to vote by mail, but you can vote online by going to your Smart Hub account. And if you haven't voted already, you can fill out a proxy there. And all the details about how to do that are on our repowerrec.com website. So I think it's an important election. One very astute co-op member wrote to me and said, well, how are you going to change all this if you're elected to the board? Well, that's a good question, because if I am elected, I'll just be one of 9 board members. And I'll be the first board member who's really run as a challenger and tried to get on the board without the blessing of the incumbent board members who often have ways of controlling election outcomes. But I think my election itself would send a strong message, or even a good vote, good turnout for me, sends a message that people want change on the broadband issue. Beyond that, I will be a strong independent advocate for broadband. There's a culture on the board that's been there for decades where the board members tend to go along to get along, and they don't ever challenge much. They don't, I don't think, engage in a lot of original thinking or push the management when the management sometimes needs a little nudge. My aim is to do that. I'll do it respectfully. I'll have to work with my colleagues on the board, and I have a long history of working collegially with people on boards and in other settings. So, you know, I can't promise that I personally will change everything overnight, but I will do my best to try to make sure that this happens sooner rather than later. So with that, I think I'll turn it back to Daniel, because I know people have questions, and I wouldn't be surprised if most of them are for Chris, but go ahead, fire away, give us your questions for Chris or for me. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Seth. And we have had a number of questions come into the chat. So I think the way that we're gonna do this, feel free to keep typing questions into the chat as you have them, and we're keeping track of it. So we will kind of call on me, call out your name as we get to your question, and then you'll be unmuted and we'll be able to ask that question directly to the panelists. So going back to the beginning, we had a question from Alexandria Butler. Alexandria, are you there? appears so, but she's muted.
Maybe you could read it, Daniel.
Yeah, I've allowed her to speak, but she's still muted.
Okay, so the question is, I would like to know if REC currently has the infrastructure in place to provide internet service or access to member owners as soon as possible. As a resident who's lived in the far east end of Louisa County for 10 years, with no true broadband internet, I cannot emphasize enough the sheer frustration at not having this service. She's been told for years that it was coming, and that timeline has been pushed back.
Yeah, and I think the best way to answer that is to look at this broadband position statement, which I have in front of me, which you can find on the REC website. It's a little hard to find, but if you do a search for broadband on the myrec.coop, you can find it. But they have been talking about building this network for a long time. What the statement says that in September of 2019, just last fall, REC began constructing a fiber optic network for utility operations. When complete, this network of approximately 800 miles will connect over 130 endpoints, such as substations, radio towers, offices, etc. So the answer is no, they don't have it built now. They're not, the co-op is not in a position to do this in the near term, but they have started building that trunk line network. And then the question then is, will they then, as they're saying now, for the first time they might consider, will they then start something and do fiber to the home? I know that some of the grants that they're applying for have deadlines where you have to reach a certain number of people by a certain deadline. So they're holding people's feet to the fire, the government that's putting up money to pay for some of these things. So I think now it's a crucial time. They're behind. This could have been done sooner. I wish it had been in other co-ops, but they have started to build it. And the time is now for the co-op members to really put the pressure on their co-op and let the management and the board know that we co-op members, this is a high priority for us.
I thought I heard Alexandria say something. Thank you, Seth. We had another question come in from Michael Vosberg. Michael, are you able and unmute to ask your question?
Okay, sorry, I had to find him and unmute him. I think he can talk now if he wants to.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. I'm actually on an advisory board to the Board of Supervisors in Caroline County, trying to find solutions to the broadband problem. And the question that I had is anyone aware of the efforts of the Board of Supervisors? They are actually submitting a VATI grant for funding for 2 fiber projects in cooperation with Atlantic Broadband.
Well, Michael, thanks for the question. I mentioned Louisa County. Louisa is an interesting county because half of it is getting broadband by another electric co-op. And then the other half is served by our co-op, Rappahannock Electric. And that's the half of the county that's upset, and rightly so. If you go to the Louisa County government website and look at the meeting, I think it was held on June 23rd at 2 p.m. You can watch an hour-long video that talks about what REC is doing in Louisa County. I know that in Rappahannock County, this has been a big issue, and there's been a lot of press coverage on the REC has written to different counties asking them if they'll put up money. Again, this points up a lack of transparency. I'm not an REC insider. I don't have access to anything unless they put it in the press or on their website. So I don't know what they might be doing in Caroline County, but I just know that, REC covers parts of 22 different counties. And all I know is that other co-ops have been doing this and are way ahead of ours. If you know a little more about Caroline, tell us, or you can write to me. I put my email and Chris's email in the chat for people who want to get in touch with us after.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea.
I'd be happy to talk to you offline in more detail. You may have a lot to tell me that I don't know. Again, I wish our co-op was be more upfront about it. And these are things that our board members ought to be telling us about, but they don't.
Absolutely. We've kind of gone to the point of saying REC is, talks a good game, but they're not following through. So hence that's why we're going after the VATI grants and this cooperation. Basically 1/3 Atlantic Broadband, 1/3 Caroline County, and hopefully the other portion would be the VATI grants.
Okay, well, check out that Louisa video. I think you'll find that.
I will. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Kathy, did you have a comment as well?
You hear me?
Yep.
I live in the western part of Carolina, and I know what they're working on, and I'm part of Repower REC. And broadband is a huge issue for me. I keep fading in and out. I'm on my phone right now because the broadband didn't work. But from my understanding, Atlantic Broadband will be helping like the eastern part of the county, but those of us in the west, it doesn't really work for us. Partly because Comcast at one point had a contract for the west, chose to do nothing with it, and but are sitting on it, and so we're sort of stuck. And all I have is HughesNet. That's my only option at this point.
I understand that. In fact, this is going to be a progression of a series of projects over continuing future years. And we are very much aware of what Comcast is doing or trying not to do. Comcast is not providing us with their fiber map, so we really can't do a lot of good planning. But the effort right now is an ongoing series of annual applications for VATI grants to cover the entire county. And across west side of 95, yeah, that's pretty Comcast. We'd like to be able to cooperate with them to do kind of the same thing we're doing with Atlantic Broadband. A player like REC could come in and change the paradigm entirely, which I really do feel they should, because they're in the best position to do it. I've spoken with the Estes Park folks in Colorado, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're doing it all on their own. And the big issue, and I've talked to REC guys as well, and their big issue is well, we're a regulated company. We really don't know whether we can do this, but there's enough going on that I think we just got to get over it.
Well, they're no more regulated than Central Virginia Electric Co-op or any of the other Virginia co-ops that are already doing this. So I find that an unpersuasive argument.
Oh,
Yes,
okay,
and
well,
I would just say that I'm so tired of hearing that, whether I'm dealing with municipalities like Estes Park, which is doing a good job, but many other municipalities and electric co-ops will take harbor in we don't know if we can do this thing that 10 others have done before us, and it's not a good answer, I wouldn't say. I think it is worth noting we're seeing a patchwork of investments, and I would be surprised if we're not seeing that in this electric territory as well for REC. One of the things we saw with CVEC when they moved forward, Nelson County had been aggressive in moving forward with the network already, and they had received they used some actually community development block grants to build their network. And when the electric co-op was talking with the county on how to deal with different aspects of rights of way and things like that, they came to an agreement that the electric co-op would take over that network. And so I would expect that we could see similar things where if we see local governments frustrated with the lack of access taking steps forward, that doesn't necessarily mean that they wouldn't later want to work with the electric cooperative. We've seen some electric cooperatives in Tennessee, for instance, start by buying a local telephone company or a wireless company in order to just bring in-house a system that already has experience. So there's many different approaches, and I think the approach should be to find the one that works, and assume that there will be one that works, but also to take the time and making sure that you are moving forward with a system that will work.
All right. Clint Hyde had a question as well. I can go ahead and read that one if that saves a little bit of time, which is that REC has 22 counties of territory. The execution logistics of doing it argue that it is either 5 or 10-year effort, but that means completing a county every 3 to 6 months, which is a undertaking. Considering that each county will be multi-hundred miles of fiber at a cost of roughly $15 a mile, it is an expensive activity. Do we have any thoughts or response?
Yeah, I thought it was, first of all, it's a very good question. Clint says $15 per foot, not mile. I was going to say $15 a mile. Get out there. Start now. It is daunting when you look at the spaces that need to be covered with this. But I just recently interviewed folks from Oklahoma Electric, which have a greater density than you do. And they went in a way that, I mean, I'm not going to suggest that this is the norm. They are an outlier, but they started in February with people being able to sign up, and they started building shortly thereafter. And as of May, they had 10,000 customers. A lot of that time, they were just getting up to speed and getting their systems working. And so this is a process that can move quickly. One of the things we see is that projects will take some number of years, but it is not the case that that a large company takes a certain amount of time more than a smaller company to do this. They tend to do more in parallel as they get bigger and bigger. And so I think what you would see is that if REC move forward, you would start prioritizing areas that have nothing. Some of your areas have something, some of your areas have areas where there's going to be something soon. And so you would see a build out clustering around where there already is fiber into those limited endpoints, and where there was the greatest demand, most likely. And you would basically try to build a business case around that. So I wouldn't be that daunted by it. I think it's just something that you want to make sure you have a good manager that is fully capable of doing that, because it is much larger than most rural electrics.
Great, thank you, Christopher. We had another question from Brad Duncan. Brad, are you?
Hey, yeah, my question is, Seth, what would you do to get the community involved? As the other gentleman had said, that Caroline County has an advisory board with the community. What would you do to actually get us involved to help figure out the areas? As you said, the back half of Louisa County, I'm actually in that half of the county and do experience these issues, and how you would do that to improve the quality of service and actually getting that service to the people that need it the most.
Well, a lot of noise in the back.
Basketball game.
Okay. A couple of points. Of course, I have to be elected before I can really do anything other than the kind of stuff I'm doing now. But if I'm elected, it's important to note that ultimately it's the management of the co-op that has to do the detail work on this. The board guides the management. The board tells the management what the people want, and I think the board should be involved in these meetings. I was surprised when I watched the meeting that was videoed in Louisa County. There is a member of the board from Louisa County, and he did not appear to be participating or have any questions there or answer any questions. And I think maybe the Louisa Board of Supervisors might have, they should meet with their local board member. Or with all other board members too. Any board member who's elected represents the entire co-op. You don't just represent the area where you live. All elections are at large. Anybody anywhere can vote in each of the races. No board member can go to every one of the 22 counties or even some small number of them to get involved in the detail work, but certainly they can be involved. They can monitor management. They can hear concerns if people in the county feel that they're not making headway with the employees of the co-op, and then they can apply pressure in that way. So I'll know more if and when I get on the board. Again, I've been pressing for the board meetings to be held where we can observe them. I don't know if there's some board members who are pushing for broadband and some are not. We don't know because they do everything in secret. I'm hoping to change that. But the main thing I would do is be an advocate for that. And if people who were dealing with REC employees in a particular county felt they weren't getting anywhere, I would be accessible. I would be happy to listen to their side of the story and talk to REC management and see if I could use my efforts to make things work out and happen.
Great. Thank you, Seth. How about Doug? Doug had a very interesting question.
He can talk if he would like to.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm just curious about if Seth or anyone listening had ideas on how some of the COVID money that's coming into the communities can be legally spent to speed up broadband for people that are working at home that don't have it, or school children.
Well, Chris may know more about that than I do from a national perspective. What I can say is I'm predicting, given that this COVID thing isn't going away anytime soon, that there's going to be more and more pressure from all levels of government, and there'll be money available. This really is beginning to look like the 1930s depression, where under the New Deal, a ton of federal aid is what got these electric co-ops up and running. So while I wish REC had done more and had it done by now, I do think the time is right to be getting in there and getting these government funds, and I think there will be more of them coming. So in that sense, I'm optimistic about the future. I should also add that REC just has a new CEO who started this week. And so it was the previous CEO who every year at the annual meeting said, we're not going to do that last mile fiber to the home. I don't know what the position of the current CEO is, but I'm hopeful that with new management and a new outlook, and plus these trying, difficult times, things may come together. And I hope that my election to the board will also just add further incentive for everybody to get going. So that's a pretty general answer because I'm not a real detailed policy expert. Chris, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I think it is a very good question. The CARES Act funding that's available today, I'm not sure how it's being distributed in Virginia, but it can be used for improving internet access in a number of ways. It has to be expended by the end of this year, which makes it quite challenging. And if money were available to the cooperative, what I think would be feasible would be to focus on areas in which they are at or near one of those fiber endpoints that already has service. And then you would probably try to light up some Wi-Fi for free in the parking lots around there. One of the things that as we thought about how to deal with this pandemic and broadband is that it takes years to connect people. I mean, just doing the engineering will take until the end of this year to do a good fiber network through a substantial part of the network that we're looking at here. And so the question is, what can we do by September? What can we do by December? And that would be basically looking at areas in which you're going to have to put fiber. Where are those overlapping with places in which you can have secure Wi-Fi access? And I would just couple that with some of the business announcements we've seen in recent months, led in part by Land O'Lakes out of Minnesota and some others that have formed coalitions where rural businesses are trying to make internet available in their parking lots so that people can, if they have to leave their home for decent internet access, at least they hopefully would have to drive less far. And I would say the co-op would be in a position in which it could demonstrate some leadership and use some of the CARES Act funding to extend its network in ways that would be useful in the future, but also provide some immediate relief.
Okay, thank you. I'm kind of a dinosaur on some things. How much would a Wi-Fi at the end of one of Rappahannock's fiber lines, how much would a Wi-Fi setup that would do the neighborhood?
Doing the neighborhood is probably unlikely. The Wi-Fi just doesn't.
Like if it ran to a fire hall and they
Mhm.
set up a system that school kids could go to the fire hall and pick it up free.
Sure.
Is
Then
that,
you're looking at, I mean, the access point itself would probably be, I mean, if it's outdoor, it might be a little bit more expensive. And I don't track this super closely, but let's say $1,000, $1,500, I think probably a lot less than that. Your larger cost may actually just be wiring it for electricity to get it to the right spot. And then the actual cost of extending the fiber to that point. So, you know, I would say you're looking at a few $1,000s and up to 10,000, depending on some of those extra costs. But the actual device to distribute the Wi-Fi, I see Clint in the chat room has agreed $1,000 would do it. And so,
okay,
you know, some of that
thanks.
one of the things I'll say is that I think sometimes as policy folks, we think about how to do this with official, you know, labor. And I think there's a lot of things in rural areas you can find volunteer labor that can get a lot of this done quicker. And it's worth thinking about.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And then I think we had a question from William Osborne.
William, you should be able to talk now if you want to ask your question.
There you go.
Yes, I was just asking if there was a place that we can find the 800 endpoints that are being constructed that Seth was mentioning.
Actually, it says there are 130 endpoints and 800 miles of fiber optic cable.
My bad, I probably mixed that up.
Maybe I mixed it up. There are 130 endpoints, and they describe the endpoints as substations, radio towers, offices, etc. The best way to find that out would be to email or call REC. Probably if you call customer service, they're not going to know the answer, but I expect they would get back to you and give you a little more detail on that.
And let me just say, this actually reminds me of one of my favorite stories. I can't believe I forgot to share it. One of the things we've seen in a lot of areas is school buses that they park in, whether it's rural or urban areas, and they put a device that takes LTE wireless signals, turns them into Wi-Fi so people can congregate near the school bus instead of kind of a mobile device. Ozarks Electric decided that they would run fiber to those school buses. And so they're mainly using them for shelter from the weather and for a constant source of power. But they are actually, I mean, that's an electric co-op in which they are really responsive to people's needs. They basically said, we're building fiber out to people's homes, but in the meantime, we can park school buses near accessible fiber, run the fiber into the school bus, and we'll have the best Wi-Fi access points you can imagine. And that's been pretty well received by the community.
Great. All right. So we are.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, William. So we are running pretty close to time here. And so I think we've got time for one more question. And then for folks who've put questions in the chat that we have not had a chance to answer, we are keeping a record of all of the questions that have been put in the chat, and we'll reach out with answers as we have them as well. So we've got time for one more question. Aaron Such, I believe, had a question.
Thank you, Daniel. I wanted to build on a question earlier about what the board or what Seth, your candidacy would do for broadband. But is your opponent also pushing for this? You mentioned you're in a contested race. What's the position of your opponent on broadband?
Well, my opponent doesn't really say anything in anything he's put up publicly on the REC website, and he doesn't have a website of his own. He has been quoted, he's been interviewed by a couple of, published in a couple of newspapers. There was a story in the Rappahannock News, the weekly paper in Rappahannock County just last week, with the headline, "Don't count on REC funded broadband in Rappahannock County," says board member Sanford Reeves Jr. And what he did, what Mr. Reeves seemed to be doing was repeating the talking points that I heard REC's CEO giving in the last annual meeting and the meeting before that and the meeting before that, that we can't do it because we don't have a monopoly for it and we want someone else to do that last mile. So he seems to be not an advocate for moving off the dime from that old position. And as they said at the Louisa meeting, it's going to take the board to approve anything if we're going to do something. So I haven't talked to Mr. Reeves about it. I've been an advocate for REC having candidate debates, sessions like this where anybody could call in and hear from both candidates at the same time. But I do think that I've been more engaged and more knowledgeable, frankly, although I don't claim to be all that knowledgeable about what can be done, partly because I spent a lot of time looking at what other co-ops are doing. I go annually every year to the Rural Energy Conference. And I've heard the CEO of a co-op in Arkansas twice now give a speech about how they decided we have to do this. Our community needs it, and we can't really succeed as a utility if our community isn't succeeding. And so his board and he made the decision years ago that they were going to go and install broadband to the home of everybody, every member of the electric co-op who wanted it. I heard the similar speech from the president of an electric co-op in Michigan, and they did it. And I heard that speech almost 2 years ago. The trouble is, I don't think REC board members go to conferences like that. They kind of are a little bit narrow in their scope of what they do. I'm not allowed to go to the NRECA conferences that they go to, and I'm not allowed to observe their board meetings, but I have been attending conferences and webinars by organizations, which is how I know enough to know that many other co-ops are doing this. And I have yet to hear anybody at REC explain why, in a persuasive way, why we can't do what Central Virginia Electric Co-op or several other Virginia co-ops are doing. So it's not a perfect answer, but that's kind of the best I can do.
Great. Thank you, Seth. So we're at the hour now. So we'd like to thank everybody for coming. First and foremost, if we did not get to your question again, we'll follow up. One thing I would like to point out, though, which I think Christopher mentioned in his chat at the beginning, is that with our rural electric cooperatives, the driving force behind things happening is really with the member owners and the membership. So if this is something that we want to see happen at REC, it's going to take more than just electing Seth to the board, right? And it's going to take more than John Hewa being the new CEO. It's going to take the membership of the cooperative banding together and making their voices heard. So, we'd like to thank you all for coming tonight, but we don't want this conversation to stop here. This is something we need to keep talking about. We need to keep organizing around, and we need to keep this conversation going. So at Repower REC, we are going to look to create our own sort of task force and start to get together and brainstorm some ideas and strategies that we can use to kind of push the electric cooperative, nudge them with a little love, as I like to say, in the right direction. And so we'll be reaching out to folks who have attended this to gauge people's interest, and hoping that some of you would like to keep this conversation going. And also, we have a petition going right now that if you have not signed it, we would love for you to get on and sign it, about broadband coverage in our area, and that the link for that has just been posted in the chat. So if you have not signed that yet, we would love for you to do so. And again, thank you all for coming, and we will be in touch soon, and hope everybody has a good night. Seth, do you have any closing remarks or anything you'd like to say before we adjourn?
I just want to thank everybody for coming, and I really especially want to thank Chris Mitchell for bringing his expertise in. That's what we need here. I hope maybe we'll have you come back sometime when we're farther along in the process. And but anyway, really appreciate you giving us your time tonight, Chris.
Thank you. And I'd love to visit in person at some point in the future. So let's all hope that we end up there.
Yeah, we love